everyone. I want to say thank you to the National Whistleblower Center for having me, and I wanted to thank Sharon as well for inviting me to this. It's been truly a beautiful experience, and I think what Cynthia had said as well is when you walk into one of these events as a whistleblower and you hear everyone's stories, you walk out a whole new person. It's like the catharsis of really hearing all the sharing and really understanding that this experience and what happens to you is really the issue that can produce all these sort of personal consequences that in many moments you think it's something wrong with you, but really it's the circumstance that you're going through. So I wanted to kind of ask you guys, because Theranos is a fairly recent story, it's had an immense amount of media coverage. How many of you guys have sort of heard the case? Can I get a show of hands? Okay, majority of the people, so that makes my life a little bit easier in kind of giving a bit of a primer of what was going on. And I'll share with you guys sort of what my concerns were in working for the company and what I kind of saw from my perspective being a lab associate at the company. It was my first job out of college, and essentially what I was doing was working on Theranos' proprietary technology to test patients through a finger stick versus a venous straw and to give them their patient samples. And while I was doing this job, essentially what I was noticing is when we were running the quality assurance test for it, there was huge variability in the results we were getting. So say if I have a patient that's coming in, before I run that patient, I will run something called a quality control. This quality control is telling me this person has, 14 nanograms of vitamin D in their blood, and I know this is the answer. And when I was running it through the Theranos devices, it'd come out 200. It'd come out 2. It'd come out 50, all for the same exact sample that was meant to be 14. And so this was happening not just for one-off samples, just for vitamin D, it was happening for syphilis and all your infectious disease. It was happening for cancer diagnostics. It was happening for thyroid panels. It was happening for whether your medication was appropriately clotting your blood or not. Real serious consequences to getting the wrong result on this. 70% of all medical decisions are decided through testing, and particularly blood testing. And so working as a young employee and working with these devices and seeing that there was just such high frequency of these errors happening, and they were happening across the board, I had attempted to essentially report internally, like something's not quite right here. I don't know what's going on. And it's very difficult, I'd say, in a startup setting because a lot of things don't work. There's no processes, there's no procedures, there's no compliance department or anything. You're really all in it together trying to build up this sort of baby company into something big. Even though Theranos was 200 employees and had a lot of people, it was still a burgeoning company because it was such an ambitious task of essentially, in their words, revolutionizing lab diagnostics, which was something that hadn't quite been done at that scale. And with the amount of money that Theranos had because they had raised about $700 million at a $9 billion valuation to sort of push forward that initiative. Part of the issue through the reporting process is initially when I would talk to my lab supervisors and say, hey, what's kind of going on here? I think a lot of them would say, go talk to that person, go talk to this person. I don't know what's quite going on here, or oh, we dealt with this, you need to go talk to your new boss in the clinical lab and see what errors and issues are kind of going on there. And the problem that you have in a startup environment is your new boss has only been working there for a month. Because to be a tenured employee at Theranos, if you worked there for 2 years, you were considered a senior employee. Because the turnover on average was something like 7 months. So even for people who were in positions of power and positions of expertise, you couldn't really rely on them because they were just as lost, if not more lost than you were because they just started. And this is a dynamic, I think, that you see in these early companies more so than other types of companies. I had gone and reported all the way to the COO, and when I had told the COO essentially that I was concerned about the different issues that we were seeing in the laboratory because I had anticipated that maybe there was a chasm between what was happening at the operational floor and what the executive management knew. He essentially just said, you are a recent grad out of UC Berkeley. Have you ever taken a statistics class? Do you know anything about statistics? I need you, a person with no visibility in this company, to stop raising alarm, and you need to tell me tomorrow if you want to work for this company anymore, and you need to do the job I pay you to do, which is to process patient samples without question. So this was kind of the feedback that I had gotten from the COO based on accumulating all this evidence of all the different issues that we were seeing for these lab tests. And then I had even taken my concerns to the board. And so George Schultz was one of the board members. He was essentially, his grandson had worked for the company. So I had called up his grandson, who I'd worked the night shift with, to sort of report these concerns. And essentially he said similarly, like, basically I told George Schultz in a dinner that I had had with him that what he thought he was investing in and that the company was doing, which was essentially creating this one device that you could take the blood sample, you could put it in there, and it would pop the results, was not at all what was going on. What really was happening is the moment that people like George Schultz or all these VIP investors came in the door and got their blood sample and saw the little machine working, essentially they would take the blood sample out of the machine, they'd run it through a back door. There would be a back laboratory where there would be 6 different teams on standby, one of those teams being mine, and they'd split it through all these different jerry-rigged devices to accommodate this small sample of blood. And the only device that Theranos actually produced, that was their own IP, had failure rates up to 53% half the time. And that's really what was happening. And when I told George Schultz this, he said, you know, you seem very smart. My grandson, I know, is very smart, but I brought a lot of smart people into this deal, and they all say it works, and maybe you should look for another job. Wow. And later I found out that it was actually a big issue, even reporting to the board, that they considered me kind of a problem, basically, that I made a real mess of things. That is, quote unquote, I think what George Schultz said about me when I had come to his place for dinner. So you can tell from that experience, I'm 22, 23 years old, I have no idea what to do, right? It's like going from being very idealistic, expecting to get out of college, you want to make a big difference and a change in the world, provide affordable, accessible diagnostics for people, and the next thing you know, this is your first company, and you're like, whoa, is this how the whole healthcare infrastructure works? And luckily, kind of to Sharon's point, what happened is, because at this point, I didn't know about regulatory agencies. I didn't know to talk to a lawyer. I had no idea what my options were, because I thought, okay, there are these people that are doing these horrible things, and I feel completely disempowered, and who do I turn to? And the idea, I think in my case, because I was so young, hiring a lawyer is like, that's gonna bankrupt you. We need to not go that route. And had no idea that many of them work on contingency, and many will support certain whistleblower cases pro bono. That will kind of go to my notion of improvements. One of these things is really building awareness, especially for younger people who are entering into some of these companies. I think is really crucial, because they don't know that these programs exist. In addition to the fact, I think for myself, I never considered myself a whistleblower or even knew what that was until the media started really calling me that. So fast forward to talking to John Carreyrou, who worked for the Wall Street Journal, and when John called me at my new workplace and he said, Erika, I know you signed a non-disclosure agreement, you're very freaked out because you have been told that if you say anything about what's going on in Theranos, that there will be repercussions, legal repercussions. But I heard from other people just like you that what Theranos claims to be doing, they're not actually doing, and in fact, they're endangering the lives of patients. And it was like, whew, okay, there's that door, there's that channel to really get the truth out and to let people know about what is going on behind closed doors in this company. So I was one of the early sources for John Carreyrou's reporting. And Honestly, working with the media is a bit complicated as well. Like, luckily, there are great investigative journalists that can do a good job in really examining the case. And I think I got very lucky working with John because he had worked in healthcare fraud for a long time. He understood what we were going up against and what kind of forces were going to kind of push back on this story. To give you context, Rupert Murdoch was actually an investor in Theranos. And so that makes it, he owns the Wall Street Journal, and so Elizabeth Holmes was calling up the Wall Street Journal to essentially get the story suppressed. And luckily he decided to run it. But it gets very complicated because there were just so many heavy hitters who were on the investment board, and in addition to just investors within the company. So luckily the story went public, and honestly when the story first came out it was really underwhelming because I think it was so technical. I didn't know if people were going to understand what was actually happening. But then John was such a good journalist that he was able to kind of pull the thread of all the different fraud and abuse cases and claims that were happening. And so then it really sort of took more steam over time. Because I'd say when people first heard of the fact that this was actually what was going on, that Theranos was lying, there's more pushback than there was acceptance of the reality of what was happening. People were like, they're trying to bring down the female founder. This is what everyone tries to do. They try and suppress the innovator. And I say this is unique to startups in the Silicon Valley. It is overwhelmingly libertarian. There is this sentiment that rules, governance, legislation, policy, this is all there to kind of suppress our capacity to do things that we have never done before. And I think this is something, at least if you're working on the West Coast in the Silicon Valley, that people have to really pay attention to, that sort of ethos of you just don't understand what I'm trying to do. I'm above the law because I'm in a whole category of my own because we are doing something so outside of the purview of what people's paradigm is that we can get away with doing all of these sort of egregious things because it's just part of the process of doing something different. And so you have to be careful with that mindset, but I think it's very, very strong amongst people in entrepreneurial endeavors. Maybe it's more prominent in the Silicon Valley because there is a bit of a disconnect between the West Coast and engaging with policymakers versus companies that are on the East Coast in New York or all these other areas. So I think that's something to definitely pay attention to.
Who did you report to that got the lab shut down finally?
Yeah, so I also reported to the media, and then I reported to a regulatory agency, the Center of Medicaid and Medicare Services. Essentially, they are the agency in charge of allowing companies to process patient samples or not. Theranos operated in this bizarre loophole. So because they had developed and built the devices on site, the tests that they were running were considered laboratory developed tests. So they were not regulated under the FDA because they were not distributing medical devices. The only medical device that was actually being distributed were these little blood vials for collection, and that's the only thing that the FDA could really ding them on. The regulatory agency in charge of them was CLIA, or were the CLIA amendments, and was CMS. And so that's why it was this very obscure kind of agency that was able to essentially pull them from what I was most concerned about was the fact that they were still testing on patients, to sort of shut them down and to say, you're no longer able to test patients. So I think CMS came in and said that they're barred from running a patient sample for 10 years. There was minor sanctions put up against them, but they found like 40 to 60 deficiencies in the laboratory for all the patient samples.
But that is what finally shut them down.
It is finally what shut them down, which was great.
But y'all can hear from Erika's story that there's just no place, that we don't have enough knowledge about where to go when you want to report abuse of power and fraud and corruption. I quite often, I speak to audiences everywhere where when I talk about the Office of the Whistleblower and within the SEC, it's a big surprise that over $1 billion of rewards have been paid out to whistleblowers. it's just too much of a closely guarded secret. And I think we do need more information out on what is out there and avenues to go. But we've got some time. We want to hear from Babek. Sorry, we're running a little bit over, but we want to make sure we hear from him in the academic research area as well. And once again, look to National Whistleblower Center for how we can all get involved to improve things for whistleblowers.